What's up, YouTube? Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to go through my sourdough bread recipe that I've been working on for a few months now. A lot of people during the stay-home orders took up making sourdough, and I was one of those people. It's been a couple months now, and I've had a healthy starter for a while, and it really only takes a little bit of effort once a week to keep that going. So what I've been doing is just working on formulating a recipe. The technique is something I've amassed from watching a lot of things on YouTube and doing a lot of reading. I use a mixture of white flour, whole wheat flour, and spelt flour. This is my recipe for sourdough bread. It's very simple. There's very little hands-on time in making this bread. It's a lot of waiting, and that patience will pay off, and you're gonna get a really beautiful loaf of bread when you're done with this. Here are my flours. Like I said, this is white flour, then I have whole wheat flour, and I use spelt flour. This gives it a lot of texture and a lot of flavor. You need water, and again, I'm gonna give you all the proportions that you need. And then in a little while, we're gonna need the sourdough starter, which I have here, which you can see is very healthy. I fed it last night at around 8 p.m., and it's 8 a.m. right now. And then you'll need some salt. The first step is called Autolyse, where you basically mix your flours in a bowl with the water and you allow that to hydrate for half an hour. Mass is very important. This is hard to do by volume because the flours get packed down and it's really difficult to do. So I would say invest in a scale. This scale was $12, I think. The proportions are basically 2/3 are white flour, and then the remaining third is made up of the whole wheat and the spelt flour. I'll go in first with the spelt, and if you're a little over or under, it's okay. You can make it up with the other flours, and the accuracy is not exactly that important. So 60 grams. 60 grams of the whole wheat flour. A little over on that. Now the white flour, 240 grams. This makes one loaf of bread. A lot of the recipes you're gonna find online make multiple loaves. For me, I find that one loaf at a time is enough. And you always have the starter in your fridge or on your counter if you ever want to make more. So we have all of our flours in the bowl. I'm going to give that a little mix. Now use your hands for this. It gets infinitely more difficult when you try to use implements in here. I'm going to go right in with all the water. And now what you do is just work it in from the outside. I'm using room temperature water. It gets a little bit warm as this mixes in. I would say make sure you're scrubbing down the sides as much as you can. At this point, you're not looking to make something that's completely homogeneous. It's going to be a shaggy mess, but you at least want to make sure that all the flour is touching some water. So if you have dry spots, that's what you want to avoid. Make sure every time that you touch this dough, make sure you clean your hands. It doesn't have to be perfect either. So like at this point, I think I'm going to call it, and you want to get all that back in there. So there's the beginning of our dough. You're only leaving this for about 30-40 minutes. It's been just about 30 minutes, and we're ready to add our sourdough starter to this Autolyse dough. I have a really decent sourdough starter. It's crept up quite a lot. Once I put something in there, it's actually going to deflate. So I would say I have about a cup here. So you want about half a cup. That's perfect, because what you can do is you can take the remainder and just feed it like you would normally feed your sourdough starter. I'm gonna add the remainder of the starter to a bowl. I'm gonna add about 100 grams of water and 100 grams of white flour. I alternate my feedings between white and whole wheat flour so that it's always about 50% whole wheat. I just find that gives me the flavor that I like in the sourdough starter. A lot of your flavor, it comes from the starter. So you're gonna find the balance that you like for it. But once that's done and I have the starter back in the jar, that's going to go right in the refrigerator. And like I said, it needs to be fed every week to 10 days. And at that point, it's 100 grams of flour at each feeding. So I'm going to take off that, and you'll see the flour is now, it's increased in size. It's hydrated with the water. You don't want to add all of it because you'll end up with a really sour loaf. You want to add just enough to get it working, and you want to go right on top of it. You could pour, that's perfectly acceptable. So a little bit on top, about a half a cup, the third to half a cup is plenty. Wet hands works best for this. I like to just poke it down into there, and then once I have that going like that, I'll lift it up and fold. Now the lift and fold is going to be what you're going to do the most. That's the most work you're going to put into this. Once it's all nice and incorporated, that really doesn't even take long. I'm going to add my salt, It takes about, this is where you go to taste. I would say maybe between 1 and 2 tablespoons. Knock this into it. At this point, you really haven't developed much gluten, so there's really not much you can do to mess this up at this point. Once you have it at that point where everything's nice and homogeneous and incorporated, cover it for half an hour. At this point, every half hour you're going to go in and do what's called stretch and fold. That's where you build the gluten structure and you kind of make like a balloon. You don't have to knead sourdough. That's the beauty of it, is that it's very little work. I'll show you how we do the stretch and folds, and I like to do between 3 and 4 stretch and folds. That's just to make a nice chewier loaf. So this is going to sit for half an hour, and then we'll come back and we'll do our stretch and fold. And you'll see that's nice and incorporated. It's got a little bit shiny, so I'm going to just dampen my fingertips a little bit. Now it's called stretch and fold, so all you're going to do is pull the dough up and fold it over. So first, you'll see it's still a little bit shaggy, so I'm going to pull it and just fold it over itself. And then I turn the bowl to keep my hand in the same position. So do the same thing here. You're going to want to do this 4 or 5 times. So here, and then right there. And you'll see what ends up happening is you get it's folded over itself. The bottom is nice and taut against the bottom of the bowl. You just leave it like this, and what happens is at each interval it's going to expand a little bit, and then you're going to do that again, and you're kind of creating the gluten structure at this point, and you're letting the yeast inside of the sourdough starter do the work for you. I'm going to put the cover back on and then do this again in another 30 minutes. Let's take a look. You'll see it kind of flattened out again, and it seems to be growing, which is exactly what you want. I'm going to give it a quarter of a turn, wet my fingers again, not just damp, you just need it to be damp. And you come underneath. Working with damp fingers actually makes this easier. Pull it up a little and over. And again, same here. And do that until the entire original surface is covered. So it's either 4 or 5 times. Pull your cover back on and come back and do it again in half an hour. It's time for the final stretch and fold. Lift up our cover. So there we go. You'll notice it's probably a little bit more than 1.5 times the size that it was before. Come underneath. Stretch and fold. Stretch and fold. Now we're ready for this to basically develop into a loaf. Cover that up. And now this sits for 2 hours. That's an estimate. Right now my house is sitting around 71 degrees. It's going to be 2 to 3 hours. If you let it go a little more, it's not a problem. If you let it go less, you just might have a smaller loaf. This is the time where the yeast in the starter start to actually really puff up the dough. Flavor starts to develop at this point too. So this is kind of a crucial step. If your house is hotter, definitely go for a little bit less time. Now it's supposed to be about double or triple in size. We're ready for our pre-shaping phase. Our dough has been now resting. It's been about 2 hours and 45 minutes. We're gonna check the dough first. Oh yeah, so we've doubled in size. You can see it's like a balloon. It's kind of puffed up quite a lot. There's very little you could do really to mess it up at this point because you've already started the network. So you could basically fix it by just letting it rest a little longer. First thing you'll want to do, I have a little piece of hardware here that's extra. It's a mesh strainer. So I'm actually going to use that to dust my board. At this point, you don't want too much flour to get on your board or on your dough. You actually want it to be a little bit sticky so that when you're working with it, it sticks to itself and doesn't stick to the board. But if you add too much flour at this point, you're going to dry out your bread. Now you don't need a lot, a little bit. That's plenty. Something else that's really helpful is a bench scraper. If you have one of these, you can do it without this. It just makes it a little bit more difficult. We're going to use this to actually work the dough away from the counter. And what I'm going to do is actually take my flour and just flour it a little bit. Come underneath and turn it out onto the bench. This is called pre-shaping. So what you do is try to make it a rectangle, okay? As close to a rectangle as you can. Then roll it onto itself one time there. Roll it onto itself one time there. one time here, and then just like that. Now what I'm going to do is use the bench scraper and just scrape it to close up that bottom part. I'm going to pat this with a little bit of flour, just a little. All right. Make sure it's not sticking anywhere to the board. I take the same cloth that we had on it before and just lightly drape it over the top. This rests, this is called the bench rest. It rests for about 30 to 45 minutes. This is where any of the air that you just knocked out of it is gonna come back in. The yeast is still eating the flour, it's digesting the flour. It's going to create more flavor as you do this. We'll let this rest for half an hour. You can take a little shortcut on this and you can actually bake it within 4 hours of doing this next step. I would say though, invest the extra time to let this sit, chill out in the refrigerator overnight. Let's lift this up and you see it already doubled in size from what it was. So now we're gonna do a final shaping, and in order to do that, we need to set something up. So I'm actually gonna put this aside for a second. If you have like a banneton, which is a basket that is lined with like a cloth, use that, but I don't. So the way I get around it is I use my colander and I use the same rag we've been using to cover it, and I'll line this nicely just like that, and then I'll take the flour and I'll dust it. You want basically a light layer of flour so that the dough doesn't stick to the rag. That's about it. I think it was less than a tablespoon. So we'll take that, we'll set that aside, and we'll deal with our dough. So the first step that we need to do, we need basically do exactly what we did before in the pre-shaping. So what we have to do is get the top to be touching the board. So in order to do that, I'm gonna use my bench scraper and flip it. Just like that. You wanna turn it into a rectangle again, stretch it out nice and flat, and when you push down on this, there's a ton of air in there. This is like a balloon. So again, you go like that, come over, and then roll it under, just like that. Use your bench scraper to make it a tight ball. So now we come back with our poor man's banneton. Back with your bench scraper. I'm trying to catch this all in frame. Face down inside of there. Now you see here there's like a seam. What you want to do is basically close that seam up. Just like that. So we'll fold up the sides just like that. You don't want to put pressure on it. The idea is just to create this nice little covered atmosphere for the dough. And then another thing I find helpful is just take a plastic shopping bag, if you still have any of those, or any kind of bag, put it in there, and then close it up. Now this goes in the fridge. Like I said, that's gonna sit for about 24 hours. The yeast is still alive, it's still rising. You don't wanna proof it too long. It's just gonna slow it down. We've been at room temperature for the most part now. Now they're gonna be cold, so it's gonna be a little bit slower. Like I said, this is where flavor develops, so you can do this, you can bake it within 4 hours. I would say though, plan ahead and do this overnight. So it's the next morning, our bread has proofed in the refrigerator overnight, and we have a little bit of prep work that we need to do so that we can bake this bread. First thing I'm gonna do is set my oven. We'll use the bake function, 500 degrees. I have my Dutch oven. This is really the only thing that's kind of required. Basically, we're gonna bake the loaf inside of this Dutch oven. We're gonna start it covered. About 20 minutes into the bake, we're gonna back down the oven, remove the cover. So what that does is it creates like this steamy environment while it's rising in the oven. So this has to go in the oven and preheat for about 45 minutes at 500. Wow. All right. So I just pulled the bread, the dough out of the refrigerator, and it's right here. I have my parchment paper here. All right, so first parchment paper. You want to get a piece about as wide as your dough. There you go. We're gonna cut around it, rip it, and there it is. Looks nice. It didn't stick. That's good. What you want to happen is when you push it, you want it to actually snap back a little bit. That's how you know it's ready. Like I said, that could take anywhere from 4 hours to overnight. So from here, this is where it gets a little tricky. You basically want to turn it over onto your parchment. And then it should peel right off. And it did. Look at that. So that looks beautiful. So now this is going to be my handles to put it in the oven. So I don't need a lot of this parchment. So I'm going to cut it away. The parchment is really there just to help you lift it, because you got to get that into the oven. So now cutting it, it's not too hard. Don't overthink this. Just get a sharp knife, and you want to cut a good gash into it. You want to try to get it as close to one time all the way through. I like to do this kind of half moon shape, if you see. And you want it to be about 1/2 inch thick. The more you mess with it, the more jagged it's going to be. So try to get this in one swoop. This is where it's going to puff out of, because this outer shell is a little bit dry and inside is nice and wet. So as this hits the high heat, it's going to expand, and that's where it's going to expand from. First things first, need to remove my Dutch oven lid. This is screaming hot. So hold it by the handles. That's it. So put the lid right back on. Again, very hot. Close it. Now that goes for 20 minutes. And after 20 minutes, we're gonna back the oven down to 450, take off the lid. During that initial 20-minute bake at the really high temperature, basically what you're doing is shocking the dough, and you're putting it in an environment where it's going to be very moist. That moisture is gonna help it actually rise in the oven. So we've done all this work to create this gluten structure. Now it's basically gonna hold in all the air. By baking it, it's gonna expand even more. The evaporation of the water is going to cause more of a rise. During the second part of the bake, where we take the lid off, what happens is you're gonna get that crispness. The first part is 20 minutes at 500. Take off the lid, then it's 450 for between 20 and 30 minutes. I'm gonna go for 25 minutes because I found that 30 minutes for this loaf with the spelt and the whole wheat flour actually makes it a little bit too crispy to my taste. Timer went off, it's been 20 minutes, so now is where we find out whether all the hard work we put in worked out or whether it was a flop. That comes off, wow, look at that. That looks really good. All right, so now you notice it's a little pale, so I'm gonna leave it in there. We're gonna turn the oven off. We don't want too much heat to escape right now. Oven goes to 450, and this goes for another 20 to 25 minutes. Nice and golden. So there we go, our bread is ready. So next thing to do is to actually get this out onto a wire rack. I'm just gonna use the same rack as my oven. There's plenty of space under it. And this is kind of the tricky part, is doing this. All right, so there we go. Now, this looks amazing. You can tell it's really hard. This needs to sit at room temperature for a while. If you actually stay here with your ear to it, it's gonna sound like it's crackling. This is extremely hot, it's 500 degrees. As it cools, it's gonna settle. This is when you develop your crumb. If you were to cut into that right now, the whole thing would collapse and it would get dry and gross. So let it cool down to room temperature. So here's a look at the bread. Now that's basically a beautiful loaf of sourdough bread. If you do this, you'll never have to buy a loaf ever again. Nice and crispy. And this is not fully down to room temperature, but it's close enough. And you can see all that beautiful crumb. Now this takes a little work to cut into it, so use your serrated knife. There we go, look at that. That is amazing. Let's talk first about how to store this. It couldn't be simpler. I'm actually gonna move the board. Just use a towel, similar towel to what we had before, cotton towel. And what you're gonna do is basically cover up the face of the bread. It's like a shroud for your sourdough. Just like that. This will last on your counter just like this for 2 to 3 days. After 2 to 3 days, put it in a plastic Ziploc bag, and then it's good for maybe 4 or 5 days total. How do you eat sourdough bread? I like to take like Kerrygold butter. Just take a little bit of the butter. And I buy unsalted, so we go on with the butter. Now this is flaky Maldon salt. It's like a fancy salt, so just a little sprinkle of the salt on top. That is the perfect way to serve sourdough bread. We came all this way, we invested all this time, about a day and a half total, maybe 10 minutes total time working with this dough, and now it's finally time to taste the fruits of our labor. So, here's our sourdough. I cut off a pretty big slice. So amazing. It's chewy. It's a perfect home for the butter with the nooks and crannies. Most importantly, it has a nice, like, I don't want to say sour because sour is not a nice flavor, but it has a really, really deep flavor from the sourdough starter. There's a lot of like vinegars and things like that that are a byproduct of the fermentation process. As those flavors develop, as the yeast is eating away at the flours that you have in there, we have a mixture of whole wheat and spelt. All of these things really kind of build together to create a truly amazing piece of bread. You could see the network of bubbles. So I hope you found this tutorial useful in making sourdough. At the beginning, I found it very daunting to make my own. And the first couple times that I did it, I really didn't do a great job. And it's one of those things that once you get the hang of it, and once you realize that it's not as complicated as it seems, the fact that it's even simpler than it seems, once I had it broken down to the point where I was confident enough to do it, I was making really good bread. If you like this video, do me a big favor, give it a like. Make sure you leave a comment down below if this inspired you to make your own sourdough. Tag me in your posts on social media. My handle on Twitter and Instagram is DairyX. Subscribe to the channel if you like this video, and make sure you hit that notification bell. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you have an amazing day.